The candlelight from 1,000 beeswax tapers cast golden shadows across the Carrington ballroom as Margaret Ashworth pressed herself deeper into the uncomfortable chair that had become her customary perch for these interminable evenings, the lavender silk of her gown marking her as neither fully in mourning nor truly among the vivacious debutantes who swirled past in clouds of white muslin and girlish laughter, and she kept her eyes fixed on the dancers, though every turn of the music sent a fresh spike of pain through her chest as she watched James Pembroke, Earl of Westfield, guide yet another young lady through the intricate steps of the waltz, his dark blue evening coat a perfect complement to Miss Harriet Sinclair's ice blue gown. And Margaret noted with the bitter precision of someone who had spent too many evenings observing that this was his 5th dance partner of the evening, each one younger and lovelier than the last, each one gazing up at him with the kind of starry-eyed admiration that Margaret had long ago trained herself not to feel, or at least not to show, because at 28 years old she had accepted her fate as firmly as one accepts the changing of the seasons or the rising of the sun, knowing that earls did not dance with spinsters who had been relegated to the row of chairs reserved for chaperones and companions and maiden aunts, even though she was none of these things, merely a woman who had waited too long and watched too many seasons pass while tending to an ailing mother. And now that Mamma was gone these 6 months, Margaret found herself in this peculiar limbo, too old to be a debutante, too young to completely embrace spinsterhood, too proud to show how much it hurt when the Earl's gaze swept over her as though she were merely another piece of furniture, as invisible as the painted shepherdesses on the wallpaper, and she wondered if he even knew her name, though they had been introduced at least a dozen times over the years at various social functions. But gentlemen like the Earl of Westfield did not trouble themselves to remember the names of women like her, women who wore lavender instead of white, who sat instead of danced, who watched instead of lived, and Margaret felt the familiar tightness in her throat that warned of tears she would not, could not shed here in this glittering ballroom where her younger sister Caroline was even now being led onto the floor by Mr. Philip Ashford for a country dance. Caroline, with her golden curls and rosebud mouth, and 19 years that shone from her like morning sunlight, everything Margaret had never been even in her long-ago youth. And as the waltz ended and Lord Westfield bowed to Miss Sinclair, Margaret allowed herself one moment of pure, desperate longing, imagining what it would feel like to have those dark eyes look at her with interest, to feel his hand at her waist, to be seen, truly seen, before she folded the feeling away like a letter never meant to be sent, and prepared herself for another 2 hours of silent observation. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The oppressive heat of the ballroom had become too much to bear, and Margaret slipped through the crowd like a ghost, her lavender silk barely stirring the air as she made her way toward the French doors that led to the terrace, a route she had taken so many times before that her feet found the path without conscious thought, past the card tables where elderly matrons gossiped behind their fans, past the refreshment table where young men lingered between dances, past the alcove where debutantes whispered and giggled about their partners, and finally through those blessed doors into the cool April night where Chinese lanterns swayed gently in the breeze, casting colored shadows across the stone balustrade, and she drew in a deep breath of air that smelled of rain and early roses, wrapping her cashmere shawl more tightly around her shoulders as she moved toward her favorite corner, the one partially hidden by a potted orange tree, where she could stand unobserved and let the mask of pleasant indifference slip for just a moment. But as she reached for the balustrade, she heard voices drifting from the other side of the orange tree. Lady Sinclair's distinctive nasal tones cutting through the night air like a blade, saying, "Poor Margaret Ashworth, still haunting these events like a spectre, as if anyone would look twice at her now that she's past her prime. And Mrs. Whitmore's reply came swift and cruel. 28 years old and still unmarried, though I suppose someone must watch over that pretty sister of hers, and who better than a spinster with nothing else to occupy her time? And Margaret's hand froze inches from the stone, her whole body rigid with mortification as Lady Sinclair continued, "Did you see her watching Westfield during the waltz? The poor creature looked positively lovesick, as if an earl would ever notice a faded wallflower in half-mourning." And the laughter that followed felt like physical blows, each titter and snicker driving deeper into Margaret's chest until she could barely breathe, and she was turning to flee back into the ballroom, anywhere to escape the cruel voices, when she collided with something solid and warm, a hand steadying her elbow as she stumbled, and she looked up into the dark eyes of James Pembroke himself, his expression unreadable in the shifting lantern light, and for one horrible moment she wondered how long he had been standing there, whether he too had heard the vicious assessment of her pathetic desires. But then his gaze shifted past her to where the voices still carried on the wind, and something dangerous flickered across his features, his jaw tightening in a way that made him look less like the polished Earl who graced London's ballrooms, and more like something altogether more primitive, and Margaret took advantage of his distraction to pull away from his touch, muttering something about needing air. Excuse her, she must return. But his eyes came back to her face, and he said quietly, "They know nothing of worth, Miss Ashworth," and she fled before he could see the tears that threatened to spill, leaving him standing among the Chinese lanterns, with her shawl clutched forgotten in his hand. Margaret barely remembered the hackney ride home, her mind still reeling from the encounter on the terrace as the carriage wheels clattered over cobblestones toward Bruton Street, and she pressed her forehead against the cool window glass, watching the gaslights blur past like fallen stars while the cruel words echoed in her memory. Faded wallflower. Past her prime. Poor creature. Each phrase cutting deeper than the last until she wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. But instead, she sat in perfect stillness as the carriage turned onto her street, the modest brick townhouse appearing like a haven in the darkness, and she paid the driver with trembling fingers before hurrying through the front door, grateful that Papa would still be at his club and Caroline would remain at the ball for hours yet, leaving her blessedly alone to indulge in the tears she had been holding back since that horrible moment on the terrace. And she climbed the stairs to her room, unpinning her hair as she went, letting the careful curls fall loose around her shoulders. But the confines of her bedchamber felt suddenly suffocating, the walls closing in with all the weight of her 28 years and diminished prospects. So she grabbed her oldest shawl and slipped back downstairs, and out through the morning room into the small walled garden that was her private sanctuary, where climbing roses covered the brick walls and her mother's herbs still grew in neat rows despite 6 months of neglect, and there beneath the apple tree that Papa had planted the year she was born, Margaret finally let the tears fall, great gulping sobs that shook her whole body as she sank onto the stone bench and buried her face in her hands, crying for the girl she had been at 18 Simsuts, when she had first seen James Pembroke across a ballroom and felt her heart skip, crying for the years spent nursing Mamma through her long illness while her youth slipped away unmarked, crying for the humiliation of being discussed like a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness, and most of all, crying for the terrible moment when Lord Westfield had witnessed her shame, had heard her pathetic desires laid bare for mockery, and she was so lost in her grief that she didn't hear the garden gate creak open, didn't notice the footsteps on the gravel path until a shadow fell across her in the moonlight, and she looked up with a gasp to see James Pembroke himself standing before her in her own private garden at nearly midnight, still in his evening clothes with her forgotten cashmere shawl draped over his arm, his dark eyes intense with some emotion she couldn't name as he said quietly, Forgive me, Miss Ashworth, but I couldn't let the evening end with you believing those hateful lies." And Margaret could only stare at him in shock, wondering if she had finally lost her senses entirely, because the Earl of Westfield could not possibly be standing in her garden, could not have followed her home, could not be looking at her with such unexpected tenderness. The clock tower of St. James's struck midnight as they stood frozen in the moonlit garden. Margaret's tear-stained face lifted to James in complete bewilderment, while a nightingale trilled from the apple tree above them, its song piercing the silence that stretched between them like a held breath. And she rose slowly from the bench, acutely aware of her dishevelled state, her hair tumbling loose around her shoulders and her eyes surely red from crying, while he remained perfectly still, as if any sudden movement might frighten her away like a startled deer. And finally she found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "My lord, you should not be here, if anyone were to see you in my garden at this hour." But he took a single step closer, still holding her cashmere shawl like something precious, and said, "I owe you an apology, Miss Ashworth, one that is 10 years overdue." And the words made no sense to her grief-muddled mind until he continued, "I have danced with every young lady in London, some of them multiple times, yet I have never once asked you to stand up with me, and I find I cannot rest easy, knowing I have contributed to your pain through such thoughtless oversight." And Margaret felt fresh tears threatening, because this was worse than mockery, this gentle pity from a man who could never see her as anything more than an object of charity. So she straightened her spine and said with as much dignity as she could muster, "You owe me nothing, Lord Westfield. You have always been perfectly civil, and I have never expected—" But he interrupted her, something flashing in his dark eyes as he said, "That is precisely the problem. Miss Ashworth, you expect nothing, ask for nothing, as if you believe yourself unworthy of notice, yet I have watched you these past months, truly watched you, not just glanced past you as I shamefully did for years." And Margaret's heart began to race as he moved closer still, near enough now that she could smell his cologne, a blend of sandalwood and something uniquely him. And he continued in a voice gone rough with emotion, "I have seen you comfort wallflowers who sit abandoned, slip your dance card to girls who have none, spend entire evenings ensuring everyone else enjoys themselves while you fade into the background, and I have wondered what kind of woman possesses such selflessness, such grace in the face of society's casual cruelty." And Margaret could not breathe, could not think, could only stare at him as he said, "Tonight when I heard those vipers speaking of you as if you were something pitiable, something past your prime, I wanted to shake them until they understood that they were speaking of a woman worth 10 of their pampered daughters, a woman who has more beauty in her smallest gesture of kindness than they possess in their entire beings." And the nightingale sang on while Margaret's world tilted on its axis, everything she thought she knew about her place in the world, suddenly uncertain in the face of James Pembroke, standing in her midnight garden, speaking words that sounded dangerously close to admiration. Margaret shook her head slowly, still unable to comprehend that this was truly happening, that the Earl of Westfield stood in her garden speaking such impossible words. And she sank back onto the stone bench because her knees would no longer support her, the cool night air carrying the scent of early roses from the trellis, while somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed the half-hour, and she finally managed to whisper, "Please, my lord, you must not say such things out of pity. I could not bear it." But he moved swiftly then, setting her shawl on the bench beside her before dropping to one knee in the damp grass, bringing himself to her eye level. And the sight of the proud Earl of Westfield kneeling before her in her humble garden made her heart stutter in her chest as he said urgently, "This is not pity, Miss Ashworth. I swear to you on my honor it is not pity but something far more dangerous." And when she searched his face in the moonlight, She saw only sincerity burning in those dark eyes that had haunted her dreams for a decade. And he continued, "I thought you preferred watching from the edges. Thought perhaps you found the dancing tedious, as I so often do. And in my arrogance, I never considered that my oversight might cause you pain." And Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks again as she admitted, "I learned long ago that hope is a luxury I cannot afford, my lord. When one reaches a certain age and possesses neither beauty nor fortune, one must accept reality, however bitter it tastes." And something fierce flashed across his features as he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently caught one of her tears on his fingertip. The touch so tender it made her sob, and he said roughly, "Reality is that I have been a blind fool, Miss Ashworth. Reality is that I have waltzed with empty-headed chits who simper and gossip while you, a woman of genuine worth and substance, sat watching with a dignity that shames us all." And Margaret's breath caught as he shifted closer, still on his knee in the grass, and she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and worry, making him more human and somehow more dear than the perfect statue of a man she had admired from afar. And he said, "I find myself in the peculiar position of wanting desperately to call upon you properly tomorrow, to sit in your drawing-room and attempt civilized conversation, while what I really want is to rail at the ton for their blindness, to shake sense into every man who passed you by." And Margaret laughed through her tears, a watery sound that made him smile. And she said, "You cannot call upon me, my lord. Think of the talk it would cause. An earl visiting an aging spinster." But his hand found hers where it rested on her lap, his fingers warm and strong as they enclosed her smaller ones. And he said with quiet determination, "Let them talk, Miss Ashworth. I find I no longer care what society whispers, if it means I might have the chance to truly know you. May I call tomorrow at 3? The mantel clock in the drawing-room struck 3 times, each chime seeming to echo through Margaret's very bones as she sat rigidly beside Caroline on the settee, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white beneath her afternoon gloves, while her mother fluttered about, adjusting perfectly adequate flower arrangements, and her father rustled his newspaper with increasing agitation from his chair by the window, the entire family pretending they were not all waiting for something that Margaret was certain would never come to pass, because why would the Earl of Westfield truly call upon her when the morning light surely must have shown him the folly of his midnight garden visit? And she had spent the sleepless hours since convincing herself that exhaustion, and perhaps too much champagne, had led him to make promises he could never intend to keep. Yet still her traitorous heart leaped at every sound from the street below, and Caroline, resplendent in her rose muslin that highlighted her perfect complexion, kept shooting Margaret curious glances while saying, "I cannot imagine why you are so nervous today, Margaret. It is not as if anyone of consequence would call upon you," the words cutting deeper for their casual cruelty, and their mother added absently, "Indeed, we must focus on your prospects, Caroline dear. Lady Pembroke mentioned at the Rutherfords' soiree that she has several eligible nephews arriving for the season." Which made Margaret's stomach twist, because of course James's mother would be steering him toward more suitable matches even now, probably lecturing him about the unsuitability of midnight garden visits to aging spinsters. And then the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones made everyone freeze, followed by the sharp rap of the knocker that seemed to reverberate through Margaret's chest. And Hopkins, their butler, appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed astonishment as he announced, "The Earl of Westfield!" And there he stood, immaculate in dove-grey morning coat and perfectly tied cravat, his dark eyes finding Margaret's immediately across the room as if she were the only person present, while her father shot to his feet so quickly his newspaper scattered across the carpet, and her mother's hand flew to her throat in shock, and Caroline's pretty mouth fell open in a most unbecoming manner as James crossed the room with purposeful strides, bowing correctly, but his gaze never leaving Margaret's face as he said, "Mr. Ashworth, Mrs. Ashworth, I hope I find you well this afternoon," though his attention clearly remained fixed on their eldest daughter, who could barely breathe for the thundering of her heart. And when he turned to her with a smile that transformed his austere features into something approaching tenderness and said, "Miss Ashworth, I trust you are recovered from last evening's festivities," she could only nod mutely, while Caroline made a small sound of confusion, and their mother hastily ordered Hopkins to bring the best China tea service, the one usually reserved for the vicar's annual visit. And Margaret found her voice enough to whisper, "You came." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Hyde Park as James helped Margaret from his curricle, her gloved hand trembling slightly in his as she descended still scarcely believing that she sat beside the Earl of Westfield in his famously elegant vehicle, while all of fashionable London promenaded past during the sacred hour of 5 o'clock, when everyone who was anyone came to see and be seen. And Margaret touched the ribbon of her new bonnet self-consciously, a lovely creation of blue silk with cream roses that had arrived mysteriously that morning, with no card, but which fit perfectly and brought out the colour of her eyes in a way her old bonnets never had. And James seemed to sense her nervousness because he tucked her hand firmly into the crook of his arm and said quietly, "You look lovely, Margaret," using her given name as he had begun to do during his daily visits over the past 4 days, visits that had set the entire household into upheaval and started tongues wagging throughout their modest neighbourhood. And now here they were in full view of the town, his tall figure immaculate in bottle-green coat, while she tried not to notice the turned heads and sudden hushed conversations that followed in their wake. And they had not walked 20 yards before Lady Barrington and her daughter Cecilia approached with predatory smiles, and Lady Barrington cooed, "Lord Westfield, how delightful to see you, and with Miss Ashworth, how unexpected!" The emphasis on unexpected dripping with barely concealed disdain as her sharp eyes catalogued Margaret's modest pelisse and the small darn nearly invisible on her glove. And Margaret felt herself shrinking under that penetrating gaze until James's arm tightened beneath her hand, and he said coolly, "Indeed, Lady Barrington, I find Miss Ashworth's company infinitely preferable to the usual vapid chatter one encounters here," which caused spots of colour to bloom on Lady Barrington's powdered cheeks. But worse was coming, as Mrs. Dalrymple joined them with her cronies Lady Ashford and the Countess of Morley, all 3 women who had made sport of Margaret at countless gatherings, and Mrs. Dalrymple tittered, "Miss Ashworth, still haunting the marriage mart at your advanced age, how persevering of you!" And Margaret felt heat flood her face as several passing couples slowed to witness her humiliation. But before she could stammer a response, James stepped slightly forward and said in a voice that could have frozen the Serpentine, "Mrs. Dalrymple, I find your arithmetic as faulty as your manners. Miss Ashworth is in the very bloom of womanhood, though I suppose when one has nothing to recommend oneself but youth, one clings to it desperately as it fades." And the deadly quiet insult landed with devastating accuracy, as everyone knew Mrs. Dalrymple had been desperately trying to conceal her 40 years with increasingly obvious artifice. And Lady Ashford attempted to salvage the situation by saying archly, "Come now, Lord Westfield, surely you merely pity Miss Ashworth for her unfortunate circumstances." But James turned the full force of his dark gaze upon her and said with lethal softness, "The only pity I feel is for those so blind they cannot recognize true worth when it stands before them." Rain streaked down the drawing-room windows in silver ribbons as Margaret sat curled in her favourite corner of the worn blue sofa, pretending to focus on her embroidery while stealing glances at the mantel clock that seemed to move with agonizing slowness toward 2 o'clock, the hour when James had taken to calling each day for the past week, visits that had transformed her quiet existence into something charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. And Caroline lounged dramatically near the fire, her perfect rosebud mouth turned down in a pout as she complained for the third time that morning. "I cannot understand why the Earl wastes his time here when he could be attending Lady Pembroke's card party with all the most eligible young ladies," her voice pitched to Carrie, as it always was when she spoke of James's inexplicable interest in her elder sister, and their mother merely hummed absently while sorting through calling cards. But Margaret's fingers trembled on her needle, because she too wondered each day if this would be when he finally came to his senses. And then the familiar sound of his carriage. Wheels on wet cobblestones made her heart leap even as she forced herself to remain still, and Caroline immediately straightened, pinching her cheeks for color and arranging her skirts artfully. But when Hopkins announced him, and James entered carrying a carefully wrapped parcel despite the rain, his eyes went directly to Margaret, as they always did, making her feel as if the room had suddenly filled with sunlight, and he bowed to her mother and nodded coolly to Caroline before crossing to Margaret with that particular smile that seemed reserved only for her, saying, "Miss Ashworth, I thought you might enjoy this. I noticed you admiring Lord Byron's work when we passed the bookshop window yesterday." And Margaret's breath caught because she had only glanced at the display for a moment, but he had noticed and remembered, and as he settled into the chair beside her, their mother discreetly withdrew to her correspondence desk, while Caroline's expression soured further, and Margaret unwrapped the parcel with unsteady fingers to reveal not just the Byron, but 3 additional volumes of poetry, including Wordsworth and Coleridge, books she could never afford but had yearned to read. And she whispered, "My lord, this is too much." But he leaned forward and said quietly enough that Caroline could not hear, "Nothing is too much for you, Margaret." And when he handed her the Wordsworth, their fingers brushed and lingered for a moment that seemed to stretch like honey in the warmth of the fire, neither pulling away as their eyes met and held, while her skin tingled from that simple contact. And he said, "Perhaps you would read aloud to me. I find your voice soothing." And she opened to a random page with trembling hands, beginning to read about daffodils dancing in the breeze while the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows, and the fire crackled softly, and James watched her with such focused intensity that she could barely concentrate on the words, his presence beside her both comforting and overwhelming, making her achingly aware that she was falling hopelessly in love with a man she could never truly have. The magnificent ballroom at Pembroke House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles as Margaret stood frozen at the entrance, her heart hammering beneath the exquisite blue silk gown that had arrived that afternoon from Madame Bertrand's exclusive shop, with a note saying only that it had been ordered and paid for. And she knew without asking that James had arranged it all, just as he had arranged for the invitation that had shocked her family when it arrived 3 days prior. And now, here she stood in a gown finer than anything she had ever worn, the celestial blue silk shot through with silver thread that caught the light with every breath. The modest neckline adorned with delicate lace that had been carefully chosen to suit her age and position, and her mother's diamond clips sparkled in her carefully arranged hair, while new white gloves covered her trembling hands, and she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her as the butler announced her name, the conversations faltering throughout the massive ballroom as society registered her presence at the most exclusive event of the season. And then she saw him, James, resplendent in black evening clothes, already moving toward her with such purpose that the crowd seemed to part before him like the Red Sea, and the orchestra was just striking up the first waltz of the evening as he reached her, bowing formally before her as if she were a princess rather than an aging spinster who had no business at such a gathering. And his voice carried clearly as he said, "Miss Ashworth, would you honor me with this dance?" And the collective intake of breath from the watching crowd was audible as Margaret placed her gloved hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the dance floor as the Earl of Westfield's chosen partner for the opening waltz, a position usually reserved for the highest-ranking young lady present, and as his hand settled at her waist and they began to move to the music, Margaret felt as if she were floating, her feet somehow knowing the steps despite her racing heart. And James smiled down at her with such warmth that she forgot about Lady Pembroke watching from her throne-like chair with an unreadable expression, forgot about the whispers rippling through the ballroom like waves, forgot about everything except the feeling of being in his arms as they turned and swayed in perfect harmony, and he murmured low enough that only she could hear, "You are breathtaking tonight, Margaret, though no more so than you are every day to me." And tears pricked her eyes because this felt like a dream from which she must surely wake. But his hand at her waist was solid and real, his dark eyes never leaving her face as they danced, making her feel like the only woman in the room, despite the 300 guests watching their every move. And when the dance ended, he kept her hand in his, tucking it possessively into his arm as he led her from the floor while the room erupted in frantic whispers. The ballroom seemed to pulse with a new energy as Margaret stood beside James, her gloved hand still trembling slightly in the crook of his arm, while dozens of faces turned toward them with expressions ranging from shock to calculation, and she could feel the heat rising in her cheeks as he guided her toward the refreshment table, his manner protective yet proud, as if daring anyone to comment. And indeed the whispers followed them like rustling autumn leaves. But before they could reach their destination, a gentleman stepped directly into their path. Tall and golden-haired, with the kind of classical features that made debutantes sigh, and Margaret recognized him as Mr. Nicholas Beaumont, heir to a vast shipping fortune, and considered one of the most eligible bachelors of the season, though she had never paid him much attention since men like him never noticed women like her. Except now his green eyes were fixed upon her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable, and he bowed low, saying, "Westfield, you must introduce me to your enchanting partner. I confess I nearly dropped my champagne when I saw her dancing. Such grace is rarely seen in these rooms." And Margaret felt James's arm tense beneath her hand as he replied with cool civility, "Miss Ashworth, may I present Mr. Beaumont, though I believe you may have encountered each other at previous gatherings." And Beaumont's eyes widened with what appeared to be genuine surprise as he said, "Miss Ashworth, but surely we have never been properly introduced, or I would have remembered. You must forgive my previous blindness and allow me to make amends, perhaps with the next dance." And his smile was charming, practiced, the kind that had likely won him countless female hearts. But Margaret found herself comparing it unfavorably to James's rare but genuine smiles. And before she could form a polite refusal, James intervened smoothly. "I fear Miss Ashworth's card is quite full this evening, Beaumont. Perhaps another time," his tone brooking no argument, and Beaumont's eyes sharpened with interest at this obvious claim-staking, glancing between them with dawning comprehension before saying, "I see. Well, I shall simply have to call upon Miss Ashworth at home then, now that I know what I have been missing all these years." And with another bow he withdrew, but Margaret could feel him watching them as James led her firmly away, and she whispered, "You did not have to do that. I could have refused him myself." But James paused near the French doors leading to the conservatory, turning to face her with an expression she had never seen before, something fierce and possessive flickering in his dark eyes as he said quietly, "Could you not see how he looked at you, Margaret, as if you were a prize he had just noticed on a shelf? And I will not stand by while such men suddenly discover what I have known from the beginning." And the intensity in his voice made her breath catch as he continued, "You are not some overlooked treasure for them to claim now that I have shown them your worth. You are—" But he stopped himself, jaw clenching as if physically holding back words, and instead he guided her through the French doors into the humid warmth of the conservatory, where exotic palms and flowering plants created a jungle of green shadows and sweet perfumes. The conservatory path wound deeper into shadows cast by towering palms and exotic blooms, and Margaret found herself trembling despite the humid warmth as James led her toward a secluded alcove where a small fountain tinkled musically, the sound mixing with the distant strains of another waltz beginning in the ballroom they had left behind. And when he finally stopped and turned to face her, the moonlight streaming through the glass ceiling overhead illuminated his face with an almost ethereal glow, making him look younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him, and he released her hand only to frame her face gently between both of his touch so tender it made her want to weep, and his voice was rough with emotion as he said, "Margaret, I cannot go another moment without telling you what has been burning in my chest since that night in your garden, perhaps even before then, if I am truly honest." And she tried to pull away because this was too much, too perfect, too impossible for someone like her. But his hands held her gently in place as he continued. "I love you, Margaret Ashworth, not because I pity you or wish to rescue you from spinsterhood, as you seem to believe, but because you are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known." And tears were streaming down her cheeks now as he spoke, his thumbs gently wiping them away as fast as they fell. "I love your kindness to everyone around you, the way you remember the names of every servant, the way you listen when Caroline prattles about her beaux as if her concerns are the most important in the world. I love your intelligence and wit, the way your eyes light up when you speak of books, the way you challenge my thoughts and make me see the world differently." And Margaret sobbed outright then, unable to stop herself as he continued his declaration. "I love your strength, the quiet dignity with which you have borne society's cruelty, never becoming bitter or harsh despite having every reason to do so. I love the way you blush when I look at you, the way your hand fits perfectly in mine when we dance, the way you smell of roses and something uniquely you." And his voice broke slightly on the last words, his own eyes suspiciously bright as he gazed down at her. And Margaret found her voice at last, though it emerged as barely a whisper. "But James, I am 28 years old, far past the age when—" But he silenced her with the gentle press of his thumb against her lips, shaking his head firmly. "Your age is nothing to me but evidence of all the years I wasted not knowing you, all the dances I foolishly shared with empty-headed debutantes when I could have been holding you." And then slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head toward hers, and Margaret's eyes fluttered closed as his lips met hers in a kiss that was everything she had never dared dream of, tender and passionate, reverent and claiming all at once, making her feel cherished and desired in equal measure. And when they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "Marry me, Margaret. Be my countess, my wife, my everything." And the fountain continued its gentle song as May roses perfumed the air around them. The words hung in the air between them like delicate crystal that might shatter at the slightest touch, and Margaret felt something wild and desperate rising in her chest as she stared up at James's face, still so close to hers that she could feel his breath warm against her cheek. And suddenly all the doubts and fears that had been temporarily silenced by his kiss came rushing back like a tide, overwhelming her with their familiar weight, and she wrenched herself from his gentle hold, stumbling backward until the fountain's edge pressed against the back of her legs, her hands coming up to cover her face as she gasped, "No, no, this cannot be happening. This is not real." And she heard James step toward her, his voice urgent with concern as he said, "Margaret, please, what is wrong? Speak to me." But she shook her head violently, her carefully arranged hair coming loose from its pins as she backed away further, nearly tripping over her hem in her haste to put distance between them, because this was exactly what she had feared would happen. This moment when reality would intrude upon the dream, when she would have to face the truth of what she was and what he was, and how impossible the gulf between them truly was. And the words came pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. I am 28 years old, James. Do you understand what that means? I have been on the shelf for 10 years, 10 years of watching other girls debut and marry, while I sat in corners and smiled and pretended it did not matter. And her voice broke on a sob as she continued, I have grey hairs already. Did you know that? I found 3 just last week, and my face has lines that were not there 5 years ago. And my figure is not what it was when I was 18, and you are an Earl, one of the most eligible men in England, who could have anyone, any fresh young debutante with perfect skin and bright eyes, and a dowry worthy of your position. And James tried to interrupt, but she would not let him. The words she had never spoken aloud to anyone, tumbling over each other in their haste to be heard. Do you know what they call me? Your world? They call me the Ashworth Antique, the perpetual spinster. Poor, plain Margaret, who could not catch a husband even with her pretty sister as bait. And you want me to believe that you, the Earl of Westfield, who has never looked at me twice in all these years, suddenly loves me after a few weeks of conversation. It is too cruel, James, too cruel to offer me everything I ever dreamed of, knowing it cannot last, knowing that someday you will wake and wonder what madness possessed you to chain yourself to a faded woman when you could have had your pick of the season's diamonds. And she was openly weeping now, her face a mess of tears and misery as she backed toward the conservatory doors, desperate to flee before he could say the words that would either break her heart with their falsehood or destroy her with their temporary truth. But James moved faster than she anticipated, catching her gently but firmly by the shoulders, his own face fierce with an emotion she could not name as he held her still, his dark eyes blazing as he prepared to speak. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Ashworth townhouse on Bruton Street, casting long shadows across the worn Turkish carpet in the front parlour where Margaret sat with her embroidery, though her hands had been still for the past hour as she stared unseeing at the half-finished rosebud, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening over and over until she could no longer distinguish between what had actually happened and what she must surely have imagined, for how could the Earl of Westfield have kissed her in his mother's conservatory and asked her to marry him? How could such a thing be real when she had awakened in her narrow bed, as she had every morning for the past 10 years, still Miss Margaret Ashworth, still the spinster daughter who helped with the household accounts and ensured cook ordered the groceries within their modest budget, and she had almost convinced herself it had been some fevered dream brought on by too much champagne when she heard the knocker sound firmly against the front door, making her heart leap so violently she pricked her finger with the needle, watching a bright bead of blood well up as she heard their butler Harrison's measured tread in the hallway, followed by a deep voice that made her stomach turn over. And then Harrison appeared in the doorway, looking rather flustered as he announced, "The Earl of Westfield to see Mr. Ashworth, miss," before disappearing again. And Margaret felt all the blood drain from her face as she heard her father emerge from his study, clearly surprised as he greeted their exalted visitor. "Lord Westfield, this is unexpected. To what do we owe the honour?" And James's voice was formal but determined as he replied, "Mr. Ashworth, I apologize for calling without proper notice, but I have a matter of utmost importance to discuss with you. Might we speak privately in your study?" And Margaret's hands began to tremble as she heard her father's bewildered agreement, and the sound of the study door closing behind them, and she was so focused on straining to hear what might be happening behind that closed door that she did not notice Caroline gliding into the parlour until her sister spoke sharply. "Margaret, what is the Earl of Westfield doing closeted with Papa? He barely noticed me when I passed him in the hall, which is extremely vexing as I wore my new morning dress, specifically because Mary Pemberton mentioned he often rides in the park at this hour? And Margaret could only shake her head mutely, unable to form words as Caroline continued her complaints. It is probably some tedious business matter, though what business an Earl could have with Papa I cannot imagine. Unless, oh, Margaret, do you think he might be interested in investing in Papa's railway scheme? But before Margaret could respond, they heard the study door open and their father's voice, sounding rather strangled, calling out, "Margaret, my dear, would you join us, please?" And Margaret rose on unsteady legs. Aware of Caroline's curious gaze following her as she made her way to the study where she found her father standing behind his desk, looking completely bewildered, while James stood by the window, his face unreadable, but his dark eyes intent upon her the moment she entered. "Margaret, would you accompany me to the morning room?" James said quietly, his dark eyes never leaving her face as she stood frozen in the doorway of her father's study, and she could only nod mutely, aware of her father clearing his throat behind his desk as James offered her his arm with the same formality he might have shown at a state dinner, though she could feel the slight tremor in his muscles that betrayed his own nervousness as they walked the short distance down the hall to the small, sunny room where the family took their breakfast. The yellow walls seeming almost too bright for the magnitude of what was happening, as James closed the door carefully behind them and turned to face her, and she found herself backing away until her legs hit the edge of the worn brocade settee, sinking down onto it because her knees would no longer support her as he moved to stand before the windows, the late morning light casting his profile into sharp relief as he seemed to gather his thoughts. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "Your father has given his consent, Margaret, though I believe I may have shocked him considerably by declaring my intentions so boldly. But I could not wait another day, another hour, to make you understand that what I said last night was not some temporary madness or cruel game." And he turned to face her fully, reaching into his waistcoat pocket to withdraw a small velvet box that made her heart stop entirely as he continued. "This was my grandmother's ring. She wore it for 50 years of the happiest marriage the Tun had ever seen, and she told me before she died that I should give it only to a woman who would love me for myself and not for my title or fortune, a woman of intelligence and kindness and quiet strength." And he moved toward her slowly, as if approaching a wild deer that might bolt at any moment, sinking to one knee before her as her hands flew to her mouth, tears already blurring her vision as he opened the box to reveal a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the morning light like captured stars. "Margaret Ashworth, I know you doubt me, doubt yourself, doubt the very possibility of happiness, but I am asking you to take a leap of faith with me, to believe that what I feel for you is real and lasting and worth defying every convention of our world." And his voice broke slightly as he continued. "You spoke last night of your grey hairs and lines and faded youth as if they were flaws, but I see a woman who has lived and learned and grown wise, who treats servants with the same courtesy as dukes, who remembers the names of wallflowers and makes them feel seen, who reads poetry not to appear accomplished, but because she genuinely loves the beauty of words." And he reached for her trembling hand, his own not quite steady as he held the ring poised at the tip of her finger. "Marry me, Margaret, not because I am an earl, or because society expects it, but because I cannot imagine facing another day without knowing you will be there to share it with me, because your smile is the first thing I want to see each morning, and your voice the last thing I want to hear each night, because you have made me understand what it means to truly know another person's soul." And Margaret felt the last of her defenses crumble as she looked into his eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and love and a vulnerability that matched her own. And through her tears, she whispered simply, "Yes, James, yes." The morning of May 15th dawned clear and bright over London, with a soft breeze carrying the scent of blooming hawthorn through the open windows of the modest room where Margaret Ashworth stood before her looking-glass, scarcely able to believe that the woman reflected there in ivory silk and her mother's pearl drops was truly herself, while her sister Caroline fussed with the arrangement of white roses and lavender in her bouquet, having overcome her initial jealousy to embrace her role as bridesmaid with enthusiasm once she realized the social advantages of being sister to a countess, and their father paced nervously in the hallway, checking his pocket watch every few minutes, though they were in no danger of being late, the carriage already waiting outside to convey them the short distance to St. Scorte. Dressage's Hanover Square, where half of London society had gathered, drawn by curiosity and scandal to witness the union of the Earl of Westfield to a woman most of them had never noticed existed until 2 weeks prior, when the announcement in the Morning Post had sent shockwaves through every drawing-room in Mayfair, prompting heated debates about whether the Earl had lost his senses or been trapped by some scheming adventuress, though those who had witnessed James's devotion during their brief engagement could hardly maintain such theories in the face of his obvious besottedness. And now, as Margaret entered the church on her father's arm, she was aware of hundreds of eyes upon her, searching for signs of whatever spell she had cast over one of society's most eligible bachelors. But she had eyes only for James, standing at the altar in his dark blue coat, the same shade he had worn that first night when she watched him waltz with everyone but her, though now his gaze was fixed solely upon her with such naked adoration that several matrons were heard to murmur that perhaps they had misjudged the situation. And as she reached his side, and he took her hand in his, she felt the trembling in his fingers that matched her own, both of them overwhelmed by the magnitude of this moment that had seemed so impossible just 1 month ago. And when the bishop began the familiar words of the ceremony, Margaret found herself remembering all those weddings she had attended as a guest, standing at the back with the other spinsters and widows, watching younger women make their vows, while she smiled and wished them well and tried not to think about her own fading dreams. But now it was her voice joining with James's. To speak those ancient promises, her hand he slipped the gold band upon. Her lips he was permitted to brush with his own as the bishop pronounced them man and wife, and the gasp that went through the congregation at the tender way he cupped her face and whispered, "My darling Margaret," against her mouth was audible even over the pealing of the bells as they turned to face society as the Earl and Countess of Westfield, and Margaret caught sight of Lady Pembroke in the front pew, wearing pale blue and actually smiling with what appeared to be genuine pleasure, having apparently decided that a daughter-in-law who made her son incandescently happy was preferable to a younger beauty who might have bored him within a fortnight. And as they proceeded down the aisle, Margaret noticed familiar faces in the crowd, including several of the wallflowers she had befriended over the years, beaming at her with tears in their eyes as if her triumph gave them hope for their own futures. And she smiled back at them, squeezing James's arm as he led her out into the brilliant May sunshine where their carriage waited, decorated with white ribbons and roses, ready to carry them to their new life together. The crystal chandelier in the grand ballroom of Pembroke House cast rainbows across the assembled guests as Margaret stood beside James in the receiving line, her hand resting lightly on his arm, while they greeted what seemed like half of London society, many of whom had witnessed her years of invisibility and were now forced to curtsy to her as the new Countess of Westfield, and she found herself responding to their congratulations with a grace she hadn't known she possessed, drawing on reserves of dignity that had sustained her through all those lonely seasons, though she was acutely aware of the whispers that followed in their wake. Speculation about how she had managed to capture the Earl mixing with grudging admiration for her poise under such intense scrutiny, and when Lady Pembroke approached them, resplendent in pale blue silk with the famous Pembroke diamonds at her throat, Margaret felt James tense beside her, But his mother surprised them both by taking Margaret's hands in hers and saying loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "My dear Margaret, I must confess that when James first began calling upon you, I harbored doubts, as any mother might when her son chooses an unexpected path. But seeing him these past weeks, witnessing the joy you have brought to his life, I can only thank you for giving me back the son I feared I had lost to duty and expectation." And she kissed Margaret on both cheeks with genuine warmth, before adding with a slight smile, "Though I do hope you will forgive an old woman her interference, and allow me to guide you through the more tedious aspects of managing the Pembroke properties, for there are 5 estates and countless tenants who will be eager to meet their new countess." And Margaret found her eyes filling with tears at this unexpected acceptance, managing to reply, "I would be honoured to learn from you, Lady Pembroke, for I know how much James values your wisdom," which earned her an approving nod and a whispered, "You may call me Mamma now, my dear," before the Dowager moved away to circulate among the guests, leaving Margaret feeling as though she had passed some crucial test. And the afternoon continued in a blur of toasts and well-wishes, the wedding breakfast laid out with all the elegance that the Pembroke staff could muster, though Margaret barely tasted the lobster patties or the champagne syllabub, too overwhelmed by the reality of her transformation from overlooked spinster to countess in the space of a single month. And when Lord Harrington rose to make the principal toast, she gripped James's hand under the table, as the elderly peer spoke of having known James since he was in short coats, and expressing his delight at seeing him choose a bride of such evident intelligence and character, pointedly noting that beauty faded, but wisdom only grew richer with time, a comment that made several of the younger matrons shift uncomfortably in their seats, while Margaret felt James lift her hand to his lips in full view of the assembly, his eyes never leaving hers as he murmured, "He speaks nothing but truth, my darling." And she knew in that moment that whatever challenges their unconventional match might face from society, they would weather them together, strengthened by a love that had grown from the most unlikely of beginnings in a moonlit garden. The morning mist still clung to the rolling hills of Pembroke Estate as Margaret stood at the window of the breakfast room, watching the sun paint the vast gardens in shades of gold and green, while James reviewed the estate correspondence at the table behind her, occasionally reading aloud some particularly amusing bit from his steward's reports about pregnant cows and disputed hedge boundaries, domestic concerns that would have seemed impossibly mundane to the tone, but which filled Margaret with a deep contentment she had never imagined possible during all those years of watching life pass her by from the edges of London ballrooms. And when she heard the scrape of his chair, she wasn't surprised to feel his arms come around her waist from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as he murmured, "The tenants are gathering in the lower meadow for the quarterly meeting. Shall we go down together, or would you prefer to rest after our morning ride?" To which she turned in his embrace with a smile that still felt wonderfully new on her face. "Together, always together, though I confess I'm still nervous about whether they'll accept me as readily as you seem to think they will." And his laugh rumbled through his chest as he pressed a kiss to her forehead. "My darling Margaret, you've been here exactly 2 weeks, and already Mrs. Hutchins at the mill speaks of you as if you were an angel descended from heaven after you helped deliver her grandchild, and old Mr. Thornton nearly wept when you knew exactly which tonic to recommend for his wife's rheumatism. They see what I've always seen, your genuine care for others that has nothing to do with rank or consequence." And as they walked hand in hand through the portrait gallery toward the main doors, Margaret caught sight of her reflection in one of the gilt mirrors and barely recognized the confident woman in the simple morning dress of blue muslin, her hair arranged in a softer style than the severe knots of her spinster days, her complexion glowing with happiness and fresh air rather than the pallor of too many evenings spent in overheated ballrooms watching others dance. And when they emerged onto the gravelled drive, where the gig waited to convey them to the meeting, she saw the head groom's approving nod at how naturally she had taken to driving about the estate, no longer the timid creature who had once believed herself suited only for the shadows. And as they drove through the gates and down the lane bordered by ancient oaks, James pointed out various landmarks and told her stories of his boyhood adventures, his voice warm with love for this land that was now theirs to share and protect. And when they reached the meadow where nearly 100 tenant families had assembled, Margaret felt only a momentary flutter of the old anxiety before reminding herself that she was no longer Miss Ashworth, the overlooked spinster, but the Countess of Westfield, chosen by James not despite her age and supposed plainness, but because of all the qualities that society had been too blind to value. And as she stood beside him addressing their people, discussing harvest plans and addressing concerns with a natural authority that surprised even her, she realized that every lonely year, every dance she had sat out, every pitying glance she had endured had been preparing her for this moment when she would finally step into the life she was meant to live. The December snow swirled outside the frost-etched windows of the Harrington ballroom as Margaret stood beside James near the entrance, her hand resting protectively over the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. The emerald green silk of her gown, chosen specifically to complement her newfound radiance and draw attention to her changed state. A far cry from the lavender half-mourning she had worn to this very same ballroom just 8 months ago when she had sat invisible among the wallflowers. And now she watched with quiet amusement as the same matrons who had once dismissed her as hopelessly on the shelf now approached with eager smiles and congratulations. Lady Worthington gushing about how wonderfully marriage agreed with her, while carefully avoiding any mention of her previous predictions that Margaret would die a spinster, and Miss Dalrymple inquiring with poorly concealed envy about the latest fashions from Paris that the Countess of Westfield surely had access to, though Margaret responded to each overture with the same gracious warmth she had always possessed, but which now carried the additional weight of her elevated rank. And when she noticed a young woman sitting alone in the very chair she had once occupied, wearing an unfortunate mustard-colored gown and watching the dancers with barely concealed longing, Margaret excused herself from James's side with a gentle touch to his arm and made her way across the ballroom, aware of the eyes following her progress and the whispers about how the Earl of Westfield could not seem to take his eyes off his pregnant countess, and she settled carefully beside the girl, mindful of her condition but determined to offer the same kindness that had been so absent in her own years of isolation, saying softly, "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Margaret Pembroke, and I couldn't help but notice you seem to be without a partner for this set," watching as the girl's eyes widened with surprise that a countess would speak to her so directly, stammering out that she was Miss Prudence Blackwood, and this was only her second ball, and she didn't know many people in London, to which Margaret smiled with genuine understanding and replied, "I remember my second ball quite clearly, though it was many years ago now. And I spent most of it in this very chair watching others dance and wondering if anyone would ever see me as more than furniture." And she had the satisfaction of seeing hope kindle in the girl's plain features as she continued, "But you know, Miss Blackwood, the most wonderful things can happen when we least expect them. Sometimes the very person we're meant to find is simply waiting for the right moment to truly see us." And she glanced across the room to where James stood in conversation with Lord Harrington, but with his eyes fixed on her with such open adoration that several nearby debutantes followed his gaze with obvious envy, and Margaret felt the baby flutter within her as if responding to its father's attention, a private joy that filled her with such contentment that she could only smile at the mysterious ways of fate that had transformed her from overlooked spinster to cherished wife and soon-to-be mother. The April morning dawned clear and bright over Pembroke House as Margaret sat in the garden where James had first truly seen her exactly 1 year ago, cradling their daughter Elizabeth in her arms while the spring roses released their perfume into the warming air, their pink and white blooms a perfect complement to the scene of maternal contentment she presented to anyone who might glimpse the Countess of Westfield in this private moment of reflection, though she was hardly the same woman who had fled this very estate in tears less than a year ago, convinced that the Earl's declaration of love could only be temporary madness or worse, pity for a spinster past her prime. And now, as Elizabeth stirred against her breast, making those small sounds of infant contentment that never failed to fill Margaret's heart to overflowing, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed from those endless years of watching from the edges of ballrooms, invisible and overlooked, to this abundance of love and purpose that seemed to grow deeper with each passing day. And when she heard James's familiar footsteps on the gravel path, she didn't need to turn to know he would be carrying his morning tea and the stack of correspondence that had become their shared ritual, settling beside her on the bench with a kiss to her temple and a gentle caress of Elizabeth's downy head, murmuring, "She has your eyes, you know, that same warm brown that first captivated me when I finally had the sense to truly look." And Margaret laughed softly, mindful of the sleeping babe. "You mean the eyes that watched you dance with every other lady in London while I catalogued the wallpaper patterns?" To which he responded with that crooked smile that still made her pulse quicken. "The very same eyes that held such dignity and grace despite society's blindness, though I thank God every day that he gave me the wisdom to see what others missed." And as they sat together in companionable silence, the morning correspondence could wait, because nothing was more important than these stolen moments of peace before the household fully awakened and the duties of their position demanded attention. Margaret found herself thinking of all the overlooked women still sitting in ballroom corners, still believing themselves invisible and unworthy of love, which was why she had already begun her quiet campaign to identify and assist them, hosting intimate gatherings where wallflowers could shine without the harsh glare of society's judgment, introducing them to gentlemen who valued character over youth and wit over mere beauty. And James supported these efforts with an enthusiasm that shouldn't have surprised her, given his own transformation from distant Earl to devoted husband, often pointing out worthy young men who might appreciate what society overlooked. And as Elizabeth opened her eyes and gazed up at her parents with that unfocused infant wisdom, Margaret felt James's arm come around her shoulders, drawing both wife and daughter closer as he said quietly, "A year ago, I nearly lost you to fear and doubt, but now look at us, my darling. Look at what we've built from that midnight meeting in your father's garden." And she leaned into his warmth, knowing that every lonely year had been worth enduring for this perfect moment of completion. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the rose arbor as Margaret sat on the same garden bench where James had first proposed all those years ago, watching their 4 children chase butterflies across the manicured lawn, while he stood nearby directing the gardener about some new plantings he wanted to surprise her with for their anniversary, and she marveled at how the silver threading through his dark hair only made him more distinguished. How the laugh lines around his eyes deepened when young William, their eldest at 8 years old, attempted to climb the ancient oak despite his father's gentle admonishment, while Elizabeth at 7 corrected her brother's technique with all the authority of an elder sister, and the twins Thomas and Jane, barely 4, tumbled through the grass in pursuit of a particularly elusive orange butterfly, their nurse hovering nearby but allowing them the freedom to explore. And Margaret felt that familiar warmth bloom in her chest as James caught her watching him and abandoned his gardening consultation to join her on the bench, his hand finding hers with the ease of a decade's practice, neither of them needing words to acknowledge what this day meant, how far they had traveled from that first midnight encounter when she had been certain no man would ever see her as anything more than an aging wallflower. And now here she sat, Countess of Westfield, mother of 4 beautiful children, partner to a man who still looked at her as though she hung the stars, and perhaps most remarkably, mentor to dozens of young women who had found themselves overlooked by society just as she once had been, her weekly salons having become legendary among the town for producing the most unexpected and ultimately happiest matches. And as if reading her thoughts, James murmured, "Do you know, my darling, that Miss Prudence Blackwood sent word this morning of her engagement to Mr. Hartley? She credits you entirely for introducing them at last month's garden party." And Margaret smiled, remembering the plain girl in the mustard dress who had reminded her so much of herself, now blooming under the attention of a good man who valued her quick wit and kind heart above conventional beauty. And as the children's laughter rang across the garden, Margaret turned to face you, dear listener, knowing that perhaps you too have sat in your own wallflower chair, wondering if love would ever find you, believing yourself too old, too plain, too overlooked to deserve the fairy tale. But I tell you now from the wisdom of 10 years' happiness that love has its own timeline, its own mysterious ways of bringing together souls who need each other. And sometimes the very thing that makes you feel invisible is exactly what the right person has been searching for all along. So do not despair in your lonely moments. Do not believe the cruel whispers that say your time has passed. For somewhere there may be an Earl waiting to dance with every debutante but you, only to realize that you were the one he was meant to find all along. And if you enjoyed this story of overlooked hearts finding their match, do subscribe to hear more tales of love conquering society's expectations.